Yeah. Oh yeah. I did like two. I think I moderated one of yours.
Oh, should I do stage,
Like
right?
the third person to talk. Oh. I was like, sure. No, I'm not good. Is that less awkward? I thought I was going to. We've been booted.
Okay. Welcome. Thanks for bearing with us through the technical difficulties. My name is Jacob McCormick. I'm the photo archivist here at the Capitol. Trying to run the show with the programs. We had some technical difficulties this month. I'm just introducing Jerry and Shayla this morning. Thanks for being here. This is a program that is 26 years in the making for Jerry, who has looked at this portrait since he was just a wee lad, tour guide back in the day, and has always wanted to research and present on, has researched and always has wanted to present on this. So he's going to be brief. So Shayla can talk about the portrait, but he's going to tell us about Lafayette the man. Shayla's going to tell us about the portrait, and then we'll end things with the latter years of Lafayette's life and bring it on home. So I'm going to give it to Jerry, and he's going to tell us about the Marquis de Lafayette. Clip that on you somewhere. Thanks.
Yep. Bonjour. Bonjour tout le monde. Oui. Okay. Marie-Joseph Paulille Roche-Joubert du Moutier, la Marquis de Lafayette. Oh, give me to my thing. Was born in 1757 to a life of noble privilege at Chavannes, Lafayette, France. His family had a pretty impressive history going way back to the Middle Ages. One ancestor was a marshal of the French army during the 100 Years' War, and he served alongside of Joan of Arc. Another one was a commander of the King's Musketeers. Still another was a secret agent for Cardinal Richelieu. And if you know your Three Musketeers literature and cinema, those two would have been on opposite side. Like many of Lafayette's military ancestors, his father died young on the field of battle when Lafayette was only 2 years old. After that, his mother moved to Paris to live with her family while he stayed behind on his noble estate and was raised by his paternal grandmother. And she nurtured him on the stories of military glory that aspired all Lafayettes. Now, Jacob suggests that I add a little bit more to my presentation to get us closer to 50 minutes. So I chose to add the beast of Gévaudan. So during a 3-year period when Lafayette was 7 to 10 years old, in an area very near to Lafayette called Gévaudan, a beast was terrorizing the countryside. There's like over 200 incidents of killing livestock, shepherds in the fields, villagers. The King of France, when the news reached him, sent his soldiers down to Gévaudan to slay the beast. They spent a whole year looking for him, but only found victims. So the king then had to turn to professional hunters, and they spent another year, killed a wolf, had its stuff mounted, sent to the King of France, and the king put it on display so everybody could see the beast of Gévaudan. And still the killings continue. Lafayette, during this time, he would go out into the woods if he could get away from his grandmother's supervision, and he would hunt this beast himself. And this kind of shows you Lafayette at this very young age has already demonstrated a strong personal courage and a sense of duty to the people. After 3 years that the killings just stopped, and nobody's really sure historically what this beast was, Some suggested that it was just nothing more than hysteria from wolf attacks, just normal wolf attacks that was just exaggerated as far as the mutilations and killings. Others believe that it could have actually been an escaped lion or a hyena that was being kept as a pet or a private zoo. Certainly the descriptions that they gave at that time kind of resembles more of a hyena, because it's like a wolf, but not a wolf, slightly larger, and hyenas are slightly larger than wolves. Had a pig-like snout, had a stripe down its back. Some even said it had stripes along the side of it, and its smell got awful. And I Googled it, and hyenas do smell god awful. So that's the theory that I believe. Anyways, Jake had asked me to add a little bit more to my presentation, so I decided to go into cryptozoology. So now in 1769, when Lafayette was about 12 years old, he was summoned to Paris to go live with his mother and her very wealthy family. It was here that he would be raised in the king's court. He would begin his academic education. He really became close about the age of 14 with the king's inner circle when both his mother and grandfather passed away, and that left him the richest orphan in France. The king's advisor, the Duc Noyer, he took it upon himself to go ahead and bring in this poor orphan, this very rich orphan, and bring him into his own household, which he would eventually marry off to his younger daughter. So now for Lafayette's education, get it? Oop, there we go, had to get rid of him. Okay, so for Lafayette's education, he was introduced to the principles of republicanism. This was taught by French philosophers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Abbé Guillaume Reynaud. Both argue that natural law established equality among all men, and society should progress towards self-governance for true freedom and better prosperity. So taking in everything we understood at Lafayette at this point in his life, this personal development, it should have come to no surprise that when the American Revolution began, Lafayette, still a teenager, defied his family and the commands of his king by outfitting a ship with arms and gunpowder, set sail for America, and joined the Continental Army. Lafayette declared, "The moment I heard of America, I loved her. The moment I knew she was fighting for freedom, I was filled with a burning desire to bleed for her." Okay. And bleed for the independence of our nation he would, because he was wounded at the Battle of Brandywine while he was trying to rally troops in a retreat from a military disaster that could have ended the American Revolution right then and there. Lafayette won the confidence of the commanding general, George Washington, along with his fellow officers, such as Alexander Hamilton, James Monroe, James Madison, and John Marshall. He also won the respect of the soldiers under his command by sharing in their hardships, such as the harsh conditions at the Winter Valley Forge. As commander of an outnumbered force at the Battle of Barren Hill, he inflicted twice as many casualties on the British while evading an entrapment that was set for him. This earned him the recognition as a former military strategist and one who could quickly adapt on the field of battle. The Continental Congress gave him the task to journey to the Iroquois Confederacy, where he successfully helped convince them to abandon their allegiance to the British and forge an alliance with the Americans instead. And the reason why they sent him was because Continental Congress wanted to create a second front on the American Revolution, and that was to invade Canada. The Iroquois warriors were going to help out. But where Lafayette came in was they hoped and believed that by him being the second command of this invasion, all the French Canadians would rally around him. Okay, this was not really a feasible plan, as the Continental Army just did not have the manpower, the resources to do it, so it was quickly abandoned. However, what cannot be overlooked was that it was Lafayette that secured the most important alliance of all, and that was the alliance with France. And that was the deciding factor on how we were able to win our independence from the British. So the French, not only did they send arms, but they also sent French soldiers over, and they sent the French Navy. So Lafayette was sent back to France to secure this alliance. And when he arrived, the king put him under house arrest for disobeying his orders. And after 8 days, he was released to balls and banquets as he was celebrated as a returning hero. So Lafayette's immense popularity in France created this irresistible momentum to support the American cause. And that compelled King Louis XVI to honor the will of his people and his advisors. And let us not forget, it was Lafayette, while commanding American soldiers, that harassed and impeded General Cornwallis, that led to the British Army being bottled up in Yorktown, which ended in a decisive American victory. In 1781, the American Revolution was finally ended. So I like to discuss the, real quick, Brian suggests I add a little bit more to this too. So I'll discuss, there's this false narrative that some believe that General Cornwallis of the British Army tried to surrender to Lafayette instead of George Washington. It was kind of close, but Lafayette, he was part of the entourage during the surrender, but General Cornwallis, he feigned sickness. He was just too sick to go surrender to George Washington. So he sent out his second command, General O'Hara. And it was actually General O'Hara that tried to surrender to the French general, Rochambeau, instead of Washington. And Rochambeau just politely pointed to George Washington. So he went over to George Washington to hand him a sword. George Washington just dismissed him and pointed to his second in command, which was Major General Benjamin Lincoln. No relationship to our future president. And then General Lincoln took the swords and just handed it back to O'Hara. So that's the story of the surrender. And Lafayette, although he was in the entourage, you can see he's actually in the middle of the three. You have George Washington, and then to the right is General Nelson of the Virginia forces, then Lafayette. And that's Baron von Steuben, the Prussian that came help. Okay, and the second one over actually is, this is a portrait of John, by John Trumbull. His brother is the second one over from Baron von Steuben. Okay, so anyways. When Lafayette returned to France at the age of 24, he was already considered one of its greatest heroes in French history. Because of his popularity, he was bold enough to present the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. This was a pivotal document that he wrote that would contribute to a formation of a new French constitutional monarchy. That was to be supported by a newly created Republican elected legislative body called the National Assembly. The French reformers, including Lafayette, did not create an elective office of president like what we had in our American Republic, for they believed that because of the French history, retaining a monarch as the executive officer, like what the British government did, would be better suited for the French citizens. The important thing was create an elective legislative body where all laws and expenditures would derive from, and a constitution that would protect the rights of all French citizens. Under this new government, noble titles other than the king were abandoned. From this point on, in letters and correspondence, Lafayette insisted on being referred to simply as Monsieur or General Lafayette. He dropped his Marquis title. He also created the Garde Nationale, or National Guard, which he modeled on the American militia system, and this would allow citizens to be formed in cities and provinces across the country. So I suppose if there was another beast of Jovenin, the people of the countryside could take care of it very quickly with their National Guard. He also designed the Guard's tricolor flag. This flag would eventually become, and is still used today, as the French national flag. And it was no coincidence that he used the American colors of red, white, and blue. Of course, in French, they say bleu, blanche, and rouge. Now, the constitutional monarchy was to be very short-lived. King Louis XVI was not a very willing participant. The Empire of Austria and Kingdom of Prussia declared war on France to restore the old French regime. And Lafayette was naturally appointed to be one of the commanding generals to a very poorly trained and very poorly equipped French army. While he was off to the front trying to form a disciplined army, a radical faction took control of the National Assembly and held a resentment for the former nobility. The country eventually descended into what was called the Reign of Terror, which saw, ironically named Committee of Public Safety, begin to imprison and execute thousands. This included the King, Queen of France, many former nobles, members of the clergy, along with his own wife's family members. His wife, although imprisoned, was spared execution through the earnest efforts of the American Minister of France and our future president, James Monroe. Lafayette was infuriated. He raced from the war front to Paris to denounce the Committee of Public Safety. In turn, he was declared a traitor and sentenced to death. Lafayette had escaped for his life, and he planned to sail to America, escaping through a Dutch port, but he was captured by the Austrian army. He would then spend 5 hard years in an Austrian dungeon due to his involvement in the collapse of the French monarchy. He was eventually released following defeat of the Austrian Empire and negotiations conducted by the victorious General Napoleon Bonaparte. Lafayette was offered a partnership in Napoleon's new government, but he declined, realizing it was a military dictatorship that he came home to. Instead, he retired into semi-obscurity into the countryside and became a farmer. This is how he survived the tumultuous years under Napoleon Bonaparte, only to see after the empire's fall, the return of the French monarchy. Although they no longer had a dictator, this was not the constitutional monarchy that they tried to establish before. It was the restored Bourbon regime, where the monarchy had most of the powers when it came to making laws and expenditures. It had stricter limits of voter eligibility. And how strict was it? Only 1% of the population was able to vote. It censored the press and prohibited public gatherings. Political opponents could be arrested for criticizing the crown. The new French legislative body was more of an advisory to the crown, unlike what the intention of the first constitutional monarchy was. The old nobility was restored under Emperor Napoleon, and under the restored monarchy, they constituted a second bicameral body called the Chamber of Peers. Lafayette was encouraged by the new king, King Louis XVIII, to take up his noble title of Marquis again and serve in this body. But Lafayette declined, as it stood against everything that he believed in. Instead, he was elected to the lower house of the Deputy Chambers, where he introduced and spoke on behalf of bills to give more political power to the people. His home also became ground central in organizing and founding movements throughout Europe. He was in correspondence with Republican movements from Portugal, Spain, Germany, Greece, Poland. But in his home country, Lafayette's influence had waned. It was a far cry from where it was when he returned the dashing hero from the American Revolution. Those who served alongside him in the lower house began to somewhat pity him. One member referred to Lafayette as a statue in search of a pedestal. Lafayette himself referred to this period of the restored monarchy as being surrounded by too many timid men. So for the man who gave his country the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen, he was no longer closer to the form of self-government than where he had started 35 years before. Because of this, despite being surrounded by a large loving family of children and grandchildren, he had succumbed to depression. He also was found to be a bit irritable. One time he was fencing with his grandson, who was named after him. His grandson chided him that he was slowing down and losing his touch, to which Lafayette just forcibly swatted the foil out of his grandson's head and says, "Alors, Gilbert, you are now dead." And his grandson ran out of the room crying. Lafayette often retired to his late wife's bedroom. There she is. Lafayette often retired to his late wife's bedroom, where he spent much of his time alone, lost in his thoughts and memories. His wife, Adrienne, was a great loss to him. She had passed away during Napoleon's reign, but she had always been his rock and biggest supporter ever since they were married when he was 16 and she was 14. She defended his character to her family when he ran away to join the American cause, even though he left her pregnant at the age of 17 with their first child. She survived the imprisonment, sharing a cell with many other noble ladies, waiting for her turn to be taken to the guillotine. And she cried endlessly when she heard her mother and sister had been led away to their execution. She sent her son, George Washington Lafayette, to safety in the United States to live with his namesake, President George Washington. She and their 2 daughters journeyed to the Austrian court to plead for her husband's release. When their request was denied, they were granted permission to remain with him in his modest castle prison cell until he was released over a year later. After Napoleon's intervention that led to their freedom, it was Adrienne that returned to France and was able to secure one of her mother's old properties. And it was she that would make it a loving home and turn it into a farmstead, which they called La Grange, which means the barn. It was at this point in Lafayette's life in 1824 when he received an invitation from an old friend and the brother in arms, the then president. Oh, it's not working. Sorry, there we go. Okay. The then president of the United States at that time, President James Monroe. The letter read, "My dear General, Congress has passed a resolution expressing the genuine affection of the entire nation for you, with a fervent desire to have you among them once again. He was to be the nation's guest as our country approached its 50th anniversary of its independence. Breaking from his depression, Lafayette eagerly accepted the invitation and set sail for America. When he arrived in New York City Harbor, he was greeted by 80,000 cheering admirers. This marked the beginning of a 13-month-long tour of all 24 states, which Michigan wasn't a state, so he didn't come up to Michigan. But he wanted to see for himself the remarkable growth and prosperity of the United States, the triumph of this republic that he helped bring about. As he traveled through the bustling cities and small villages, he was greeted with military escorts, cannon salutes, parades, balls, banquets, and they made many speeches in his honor. He even took the time to meet with communities of freed African Americans and Native Americans. One group of people who would not realize equality in the United States for at least another 140 years, and another group of people whose autonomy in their own homeland was coming to a quick, swift end. During this tour, he advocated to the American leadership to bring slavery to an end and have a more harmonious relationship with the Native Americans. It was during this tour that a new generation of Americans became fascinated with the returning hero, and art and souvenirs of his likeness was in extreme demand. And here is where I'll turn over the next segment of our presentation, our art historian, Mademoiselle Sheila Croteau. Yeah, I could have been sitting here making comments about it right here.
Yeah. Okay. There we go. All right, so while on his tour, Lafayette gifted the American people with a portrait of himself. Now, to start off, why would he give this as a gift? Well, art is very powerful, and a lot can be communicated visually. At this point in time, Americans are looking to put paintings of great leaders on their walls, kind of as a way to visually represent both their young history and the power of their new nation. So this is really in following with Western tradition, which is adorning public buildings with political leaders. At first, it's a little bit rare in America, but really quickly they fall into that tradition. Now, this would benefit Lafayette, and because of his political experience, he kind of recognized that. So it would ensure that his reputation as a hero to the American people would keep living on, and then it would also help to spread that reputation. So how would it spread? Main way is going to be through copyists. So I know copying sounds kind of bad to us today, but at the time it was a totally acceptable practice. It was a really practical way to disseminate information. And aside from just copying paintings, his likeness was actually repeated many, many, many times. So through reproductions in multiple forms, really a big deal was made out of Lafayette's visit to the point that it became this major cultural moment in the early 19th century. There were souvenirs of all types that were made, so you can see some examples on the screens. Examples like engravings, porcelain items, plates and cups. We have a glass flask up there, and then textiles as well. So handkerchiefs, gloves, they had like purses and fans, and even his likeness was put on money as well. So one historian, Mark Miller, argues that the pageantry and the commemorative activities that were associated with this visit were fueled by artists, but also kind of helped to create this watershed of the arts that really, it was fueled by artists, and then it helped to fuel the arts further. So for these commemorative events, things like balls, things like parades, you needed artists to kind of come up with the whole backdrop. So musicians were making music, or composers, I guess, were making music. You had people from the theater creating backdrops and things to put in the parades. You had like big arches that were made for the parades as well, and then artists decorating everything. So one of my favorite things that I learned about, which I don't have a good picture of, is a transparency. So this was basically a large print or a large painting that they would coat both sides of with varnish. So imagine like a big painting or print of Lafayette's face, or it would say "Welcome Lafayette." Because they coated it on both sides with varnish, it would be kind of transparent. So it's kind of a cool effect. So if you think about the upcoming 50th anniversary of America and the fact that Lafayette was kind of a theatrical, dramatic person in his own right, this was really like a huge deal. Along with all of this, Lafayette did allow for several life sittings to be arranged. So he would meet with portrait artists along the tour and then let them paint him. The greatest number of these occurred during his time in Washington, and that's where he stayed the longest. So about 3 months he was there. So most of the surviving portraits of Lafayette from this time in American art are going to come out of that period. Along with these portraits, he did also bring several of his own representations of his likeness. So when he arrived in August of 1824, he had a couple sculpted busts of himself that he gave as gifts to people. And then he also brought this engraving with him. So this engraving is by Jean-Marie Leroux, who is a French artist, but it's after the painting on the right by Ary Scheffer, who's a Dutch-French artist. So this was, at the time, Lafayette's favorite painting of himself. It was actually originally painted in 1818. It was shown in the 1819 Salon in Paris, and it received a lot of celebration. People really liked it because it was a little bit more simple. It shows him as an older man. He's dressed as a gentleman. He's not ready to go fight. A little bit more fitting for his return visit. Now, the artist actually copied himself twice, so that's why the date is different. Lafayette really liked this, so the artist made 2 more copies, and Lafayette kept one for himself, and then one is sent to America as a gift. So this is officially presented to the U.S. House of Representatives on January 20th of 1825. This is not the Capitol's Lafayette portrait, so we'll get to that in a minute. But today, this Scheffer portrait is hanging at the front of the House chamber in the nation's capital. So a little bit about this original artist, Ary Scheffer. He began his career as an artist at a very young age. He came from a family of artists. So his father was a painter and an etcher. Shortly before his death, he worked for King Louis Bonaparte of Holland. So he was a pretty well-known portrait artist. His mother was a painter of miniatures, and then his brother also became an artist, and he was part of the Romantic movement in France. Now, of the whole family, Ary was arguably the most famous, in the arts at least. So he started out studying under his parents. Very young, he started to learn, the basics of art, and then at age 11, he went to the Drawing Academy in Amsterdam. From there, as a teen, he's already exhibiting, and then also as a teen, his family moves to Paris. So at a pretty young age, he's already in the Parisian Salon, and he's got this whole artistic upbringing. He starts out with neoclassical works, so a little bit more like the top right. These are going to be big figure drawings, a lot of drama. Usually it's like based on history or religion, something along those lines, literature as well. He then moves into Romanticism, so that's kind of what the other two are more like. And he becomes kind of a leader of the French Romantic movement. In America, he becomes best known for this Lafayette portrait, so he's a little bit more known as a portraitist in the United States. Now, our Lafayette in the Michigan State Capitol is a copy of Scheffer's, so ours is on the right there. Before we go any further, the contrast is higher on ours because the lighting is a little bit tough in our chamber where it's hanging, so imagine the colors are a little bit more similar there. So once Scheffer's original portrait is presented in the US House, it's put on display in the rotunda of the nation's capital. And then Simpson, who is an American artist, has the opportunity to copy it. So Simpson is not the only copyist who makes a copy. There's a couple other examples up here for you to look at. So Matthew Jewett on the left makes a copy, and that ends up hanging in the Kentucky State House. And then there's one in Maryland, which is a pretty good copy in the middle, but it's by an unknown artist. And then a little bit later, around 1840, James Wattles will also make one. And there's a couple other ones floating around out there as well. So bigger name artists or artists that are around when Lafayette has a bit more time are able to schedule portrait sittings with him. Other smaller name artists, or maybe they just, they're not around when he's got the time for a sitting, they're going to go and make a copy instead. So our artist for the Michigan Capitol portrait is James Alexander Simpson. Now, he was born in Georgetown. Unlike Schoeffer, he didn't have this benefit of artistic parents and formal art school. He also didn't have access to something like the Salon in Paris. So although he had some really brief schooling, he was basically self-trained. He's often described by art historians as being either primitive or folk in style. You can see some examples of his art, and he mostly does portraiture. He does also do some landscapes, and he paints signs. He does also become a professor of drawing, but he's probably best known for his portraiture. It is a little bit, it's less naturalistic, so less lifelike, and a little bit less polished than Schoeffer, which we already looked at some of his artwork. But it's also kind of symptomatic of American art at the time. So while we were looking to Europe for what they were doing in art, the American artists also kind of wanted to like forge their own path and get their own style developed. So American art is just going to have a little bit different style. So he's kind of symptomatic of art at the time as well. Probably his best known portrait is in the middle there, which is Yarrow Mammoet. Overall, he's really not a super well-known artist, but this one was recently put on loan to the National Portrait Gallery, and it was part of one of their shows. So it helped to tell the story of Yarrow Mammoet, who was an African-American Muslim man and a slave who was then freed and ended up owning property. So it's been kind of more recognized since that show. Along with all of this, as we know, Simpson was also a copyist, and he was actually a very good copyist. Looking again, comparing the original Schoeffer portrait with our Simpson portrait, they're really almost one-to-one, ignoring the saturation again. You can see a little bit of differences in style in the faces of the men. So if you look at like the fullness of the cheeks, it's a little bit different. On the left, Schoeffer's is a little bit more romantic and like European, French in style. So a little bit more of these pastel colors and kind of softer, more idealized or smoother finish. Whereas on the right, that's more American in style. So a little bit more of the earthy tones, a little bit kind of like rougher or harsher looking, but really and truly, they're pretty close. During the time period, some people believed that Simpson, the American artist, had actually better captured the expression of the underlip, which if you look at like the chin and lips, you can tell they're a little bit different. We don't really know today because we don't entirely know what his underlip looked like. So we can only like trust that, I guess. So we know that Simpson copied Schoeffer's portrait while it was in the US Capitol Rotunda. Now, supposedly, he's said to have done so while Lafayette was there, and then he met the general and showed him the copy. In this letter written by a Georgetown art and antique dealer, George Templeman, in 1831, Templeman claims that, quote, Simpson had the advantage of having Lafayette here while he was making the copy. It is said that the old soldier hugged him when he saw it completed and was much pleased. So this is something that art historians have kind of debated. They don't know if he would have actually had this kind of access to Lafayette. Although given the length of time that Lafayette was in Washington and then how many people he met, how many artists he interacted with, I really don't think it was impossible. I could kind of see this happening. The letter also mentions that the painting then spends some time in the US Capitol's council chamber and then is supposedly raffled off, and Simpson wins and keeps the painting. But by 1831, when the letter is written, it's come into George Templeman's possession, and he's looking to sell it, so hence the letter. He's trying to sell it for $600, but he does note that if Simpson had a bigger name, it would go for something more like $1,600 or $2,000. Evidently, he doesn't find a buyer at this time because the painting ends up in Michigan. So shortly after we become a state, we kind of want to like justify our statehood and start doing what you're supposed to do, which is hang people on the walls. So in 1837, John Almy of Kent County offers resolution in the legislature to purchase a portrait of Lafayette and one of George Washington, and that is the brown clipping up there. Towards the end of his time as a US Senator, Lucius Lyon, who's also got a picture up there, he's put in charge of finding a suitable portrait of Lafayette. So he works with George Templeman, the art dealer, and ends up getting this Simpson portrait, the Simpson copy. Now, there's not evidence that the portrait's ever actually paid for by the legislature. According to a nephew of Lucius Lyon, it's the family's understanding that Lyon actually paid for the portrait himself, possibly in land. And, he had actually owned some land in Lyons, Michigan, so that's kind of why they assume that. By September of 1840, then, the portrait arrives in Detroit. It's shipped from Georgetown on the boat, the George Washington. From there, it really briefly hangs in the National Hotel in Detroit, and then it's moved into Michigan's first capital, which is in Detroit. When Michigan's seat of government moves from Detroit to Lansing in 1847, the portrait is moved with all the furnishings. And then it's a little spotty kind of where it is for a little bit. In 1867, there's a resolution passed in the Senate to have the portrait reframed and hung in a conspicuous place in the Senate chamber. So it's put to the right of the Senate rostrum, or if you're looking at it, it's the left side. That's kind of how they word it, though. Then when the third, so the current Capitol, opens, it retains the spot beside the Senate rostrum, and it's there for probably about under 2 decades. And then it moves around a little bit. So in 1948, it's actually hanging on the back wall of the Senate chamber. But near the end of the restoration, so the 1987 one, towards the end of that restoration, the portrait then returns to its place of honor, which is where it hangs today. Now, the portrait has not gone without the need for some care over the years. So in 1897, newspapers report that it's taken to Detroit to be repaired and retouched by Louis Ives, who's up there. He's one of our portrait artists in the portrait collection for the Capitol. His son, Percy Ives, also paints several portraits for us. So between the two of them, 15 of the portraits in our collection are by an Ives. So Louis retouches it a bit because it is struck by a hurled object that is hurled during a legislative session. And then around the same time, Percy also helps. He regilds the portrait's frame, and then he rebacks it to make the canvas stronger. A while after that, in December of 1966, Hiram Holzer of New York cleans several of our portraits in the Capitol, and that includes this one. And then its most recent conservation is in 1989, and that's by the Detroit Institute of Arts. And this is where it kind of gets very interesting. So it's important to note that the story accompanying the portrait sees some modifications and kind of some confusion over time. So as the collective memory of Lafayette's tour starts to fade, the portrait of him as an older man starts to kind of fall out of favor, and portraits of him younger and dressed as a general kind of come back into popularity. So with that, the stories of the artist of this portrait and then the copyists as well start to fade. And so in Michigan, a story develops that this is actually the original portrait and that the copy of it is in Washington, D.C. And so the way that this is explained is that Lewis Cass, one of our territorial governors and former U.S. senators, that he goes to France and acquires the piece and brings it back to Michigan. And then Robert Grafton, one of our other portrait artists, in 1931, he comes and looks at the portrait, and he claims that it's a true work of art, and it has to be the original because it's way too good to be a copy. He also says it's got to be worth at least $25,000. Now, on the back of our portrait, there's an inscription that says, "From Sheffer by Simpson." And Grafton is quoted in newspapers as saying that this probably means the painting is a gift to a man named Simpson by Sheffer, even though there's not a record of Sheffer visiting the US, and nobody knows who Simpson is at this point. So he's very misguided in saying all that. Even at the time, people are questioning, hey, maybe this is a copy by Simpson, even though we don't really know who that is at this point. So going back to that 1989 conservation by the DIA, during conservation, a faint signature is revealed while they're removing the varnish. And so that reads A. Simpson, 1825. You can see it up there. It is super faint, and then you can see the general area where it is. It is completed in orange paint, and the DIA questions in the conservation report if it's original or if it was added later. But if you pair the signature with the inscription on the back and then further research that actually kind of, gives more information about Simpson and the whole copying and the story of, the Sheffer portrait coming over in the first place, all of this kind of comes together to prove that this is in fact a copy, not the original, and that the original is in the nation's capital. So now you've got a pretty good understanding of the pageantry that surrounded Lafayette's return visit. And by the time he's done with this visit, his likeness has really spread all across the nation that exists at the time. But that's not the end of Lafayette's story. So I'm going to hand it back to Jerry, and he's going to tell you about the rest of his life.
We did our Tuesday presentation. One of our docents, Ed, his wife went down to the Studebaker Museum in South Bend, Indiana, and they actually have Lafayette's carriage that was personally made for him while he was on his tour in the United States. Now, this would have just been used going up and down from Washington, D.C., down into Virginia, through Maryland. Yeah, he definitely didn't use this going through Louisiana and up the Mississippi or anything. So, but I just thought it was neat, you know, because that's how much respect. When Lafayette was here, he did not have to pay for a thing. In fact, he actually even walked away with over $200,000 granted to him by Congress, which he immediately took some of that money, sent it to one of his correspondents in London, which is used for another Republican-led movement. Anyways, while Lafayette was on his tour in the United States, the King Louis XVIII of France died, and his younger brother, Charles, became Charles X. And Charles was very concerned how popular Lafayette had become during his American tour. The French citizens were receiving newspaper articles and speeches that were being reprinted on how popular he was. He was very concerned that Lafayette was going to start a new movement that would end his rule just as it was beginning. As soon as Lafayette returned to France, he was met with a double-sided military escort of anything he ever had in the United States. Except their purpose wasn't to accompany him to his next celebration. They were to make sure that he made it back home without causing any trouble. They dispersed gathering crowds that requested to see the returning general, and they prevented Lafayette from making any speeches. But even though he went back home, Lafayette didn't go back into depression. No, after his American tour and he became invigorated, he was surrounded by a new generation of young politicians in the French legislature, and they looked to the wise old general as their leader that would give him the courage and confidence to push through democratic reform. Okay. By 1830, the king took the drastic step to dissolve the lower chambers and called for new elections. Police began arresting journalists and politicians who spoke in opposition of these actions. Fighting began in the streets between the people protesting and the police and soldiers sent to disperse them. The old Lafayette tricolored flag was brought out once again in defiance to the king. Lafayette himself didn't create this new revolution, but he quickly took control of it. He called for the remobilization of the National Guard, ordered them all to Paris, and assumed command of it. Within a mere 3 days, all the French army came over to Lafayette, pledging their allegiance to him, and law and order was restored. In a total of 6 days of what was called the July Revolution, the king and his ministers were ousted from France, and a new government was formed. But what type of government was it going to be? A good-sized faction wanted Lafayette to assume the office of president to a newly created republic. But the 73-year-old general knew he was old, and he did not have the time nor the stamina to help create a new republic and try to protect it, because he understood the European monarchies would immediately unite once again to destroy it. For republicanism was still a very dirty word in Europe. Instead, he brought forth the cousin of the former king and put him forth as a king to a new constitutional monarchy, but this time supported by an elected Republican legislative body where all laws and expenditures were to reject. You all know this. Okay. So basically going back to the original 1791 Constitution, agreeing the new king held the tricolored flag, received the kiss of Lafayette, and King Louis Philippe I was crowned. As a keeping the peace precaution to the masses and to keep the Republican faction and the new government happy, Lafayette was retained as the commander of the National Guard. There were some reforms that Lafayette and his party demanded. There was the freedom of the press again, and voter eligibility was greatly expanded. Finally, Lafayette saw the results of a Republican form of government that he sought to bring about 43 years before. Okay, Lafayette passed away 4 years later in 1834. When the news reached America, President Andrew Jackson ordered our nation into mourning. At Lafayette's request, he was buried at the Picpus Cemetery in Paris alongside his wife, where she had requested to be buried alongside her mother and her sister and some of some other 3,106 victims of the French guillotine. Also at his request, soil from Battle of Bunker Hill that he obtained while he was on his revisit to the United States was poured into his grave so that he could be buried in American soil. And this was important to him because Lafayette believed that the American Republic was the greatest government on earth. He said as much to the new king, Louis Philippe, when he was helping to crown him. He was awed during the American tour of the great progress that the United States made, and was extremely proud that he was counted among the ones to help bring forth this nation. All through his later years, there was not one 4th of July that he would let pass without celebrating it with his family and friends. For Lafayette, he believed he was an American. Technically, he actually was. He was granted citizenship. But to Lafayette, to be an American was a belief, a group of people that were committed to the principles that all men were created equal and maintaining a self-government, a government for the people and had to be made up by the people. This spirit would still live on in France as they eventually abandoned their monarchy and another Napoleon for a true republic in 1870. Now, nearly 50 years later, didn't work. There we go. Okay, so nearly 50 years later, in the darkest days of France during World War I, when she was close to being overrun by the German army, an entourage of American officers recently arrived to defend France. There we go. Recently arrived to defend France, visit Lafayette's grave to pay respect. It was the American Colonel Charles Stanton who stepped forward and announced to a fellow American, Lafayette, we are here. So I would like to end, that is a tremendous honor to have a portrait of such a remarkable individual in our Capitol building, in our Senate chambers. It stands for us today, as it's going to stand for another 200 years, as a testament to the greatness of honesty, integrity, and courage in the name of democracy. And Lafayette, we will never forget you. Oop, there we go. Okay, that is the presentation. So thank you. Merci. And Shayla and I are supposed to answer any questions. So, yes, Brian. Oh, okay, great.
Sure.
So, knowing everything that you know about Lafayette and looking at the portrait, what is your personal interpretation of what you're trying to show? Is it just like a straight up likeness of him, or is there a little more to it?
Okay, that's a good question. I think, okay, so the question is, it's a really long question, I guess. Given like all that we've talked about and all that I've done research on with the Lafayette portrait, do I think it's just a straight up likeness, or do I think that it's trying to like show more than that? I think at surface level, yeah, it's a straight up likeness, but I do think it's showing a little bit more than that. Especially, I don't know if I can go back to it here. Yeah, there you go. I think with that like background with the clouds and everything, you can almost see he's like staring out into them. It's almost like he's lost in thought maybe, or he's like thinking about kind of as an older man, all he's done, all that he's been through, all that both nations have been through, and kind of like where else they can go. I know that's a very romantic interpretation of it, but it is a copy of a French romantic artist's portrait. So that's kind of like how I look at it. I don't know if you all agree with that or not, but go ahead.
And the idea of him crossing the Atlantic multiple times, is that accurate, or are we just making something up that we want to see?
Okay, yeah, so the question is, it looks like there's water behind it, and people have interpreted that as related to him crossing the Atlantic. Is that accurate, or just how we've interpreted it over time? I haven't seen any sources from the time that talk about it, so I can't say for a fact, like, yeah, the artist wanted that to be interpreted that way. I think it's a fair interpretation, though. He did do a lot of going back and forth, and especially based on what Jerry said, it seems like he's kind of split between France and America, even though he considers himself an American, but he's so tied to both of the nations and trying to advance them. So I think it's a reasonable interpretation, but I don't have like a first person source to say, yeah, that's exactly spot on. But that's kind of how it is with a lot of art and a lot of interpreting art after the fact. Go ahead.
Do you know the whereabouts of the two other Sheffer portraits, like the original and the one that you made for Lafayette?
So the one, oh, sorry, I always forget to repeat the question. Do we know the location of the other Sheffer portraits, the original and the one he made for Lafayette? So the one he made for Lafayette is at LaGrange. I believe it's still there. That's where it went. So he kept it for himself and put it in his house. I don't off the top of my head know where the original is. That doesn't mean that we don't know. I just don't know. But I can look into it and tell you, because as far as I know, it hasn't been like lost or anything. Okay, other questions? Go ahead.
So to that end, do either of you know, is LaGrange open? Is it publicly
Might be a
accessible?
Jerry question.
Yes.
You want to repeat the question?
Yes, LaGrange is open, his home. I believe it's owned by the French government right now, or it's still owned by a private family. I don't know if it's still owned by the Lafayettes. There is his other home, the other one, Chavannes Lafayette in southern France there. That is owned by the French government. And of course, they fly both the American and the French flag above it, and people can go and visit it. I think that one's more like now, like I don't want to say a hotel, but it's more like a restaurant and stuff people can go to. So,
Extend to that questions this morning.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about how Lafayette's perceived in France today?
how is Lafayette perceived in France today? And this is what is kind of sad. Yeah, from what I understand, not too many people really know Lafayette's history or what he has done for the French government or what he tried to do to bring about self-government, bring about a republic, republic institutions into France. They don't really see much of that. In fact, I remember I was reading that book, Sarah Vowell, and then she was over in France and somebody had to come and unlock some door for her so she could see a Lafayette artifact. And the guy was just, it was raining or something. He was just miserable and everything. And he goes, I don't know why you Americans, like Lafayette so much. It was Rochambeau who actually helped win the American Revolution for you. And for me, because he doesn't understand American history and everything that, but this guy put himself out there and he was very influential. Even though some even marked that he was more like the Forrest Gump of that time period, he was in contact with everyone. Just before he left for the American Revolution, he wasn't telling anybody what he was planning on doing, but he had to go to England and he met with the king's brother and they were dining together. And there was one general there at the time named Cornwallis who was also dining with them. So he was in contact with so many people. I think George Washington, all our founding fathers, Alexander Hamilton, yeah, and even Napoleon, all those people that he was in contact with. And he did have an influence on them. Because I always stressed that part. I was looking for the part, he was so honest. He had such integrity, and he was very courageous. Thank you. Yes, Brian.
So during the American Revolution, he decides he's going to go back to France to rally French support, to persuade the French to come over and help. But when he returns, he's put under house arrest by the king for 8 days, and yet the French still decide to come help. So you can talk about that.
Okay, when Lafayette returned to France, why did the king put him under house arrest? Only when he was released, all of a sudden everybody wanted to throw him celebrations as a returning hero. That was planned by the king. And when he was under house arrest, he was with his family. He was with his wife that got to see his child for the very first time. So it was planned. The French government was very pro-American at that point. They believed, especially after the Battle of Saratoga and the American Revolution, when the Americans won, it was the biggest battle that we actually won up to that point. The French were now all in because not only would they have an alliance against the British, but they're also looking at us as a big trading partner too. And in fact, that was another thing Lafayette did after the American Revolution. He was able to help negotiate so that Americans had free trade with France during our early years. And that was very important for us to help develop our manufacturing because we weren't getting any support from the British at that point with our industry. Did I answer your question? Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much. Have a good day.